Marcus Blake, the CEO of a thriving automotive empire, has a secret. He's tired of hearing about broken promises and neglected workers. So, he decides to do the unthinkable, disguise himself as a new assistant, and step into the gritty world of his own garages. What he finds inside is shocking. A black female mechanic, Aisha, works with bloody hands and broken tools, pushing herself to the brink just to keep her job. The truth is far uglier than he ever imagined. Want to know what happens next? Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for the truth that could change everything. Marcus stood in the dimly lit corner of the garage, trying to blend in as the new assistant, John. His hands were clammy, his heart racing. This wasn't just another day at work. It was a test of his courage, his morals, and his company's very soul. His father had built this empire on values of hard work, integrity, and respect for employees. But now, Marcus was beginning to see how far those values had slipped. The clanking of metal echoed through the space as Aisha, the mechanic, struggled with a heavy engine part. She winced, and Marcus felt a pang in his chest as her bloodied hand slipped from the wrench. A sharp scream caught in her throat. The blood dripping from her palm stained the floor, already slick with grease and oil. "Are you okay?" Marcus blurted out, his voice strained with concern. Aisha quickly wrapped a rag around her hand, not missing a beat. "I'm fine," she said, her tone flat but somehow defiant. She didn't look up at him, too focused on the task at hand, as if the pain was a constant companion she had learned to ignore. Marcus swallowed hard, stepping closer. "That needs stitches," he said gently, watching her face for a crack, a hint of vulnerability, but she offered none. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Yeah, right. And lose my job?" She shook her head, the weight of her words heavier than any tool in the room. "I've got 2 kids at home and rent to pay. That's my reality. I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes finally met his, cold and resigned, as if they had seen all the world's injustices and were no longer willing to feel their sting. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a woman working through an injury. This was a mother, a fighter, a woman who had been worn down by a system that didn't care about her, or anyone like her. Marcus couldn't look away. He could see the years of struggle in her eyes, the same struggle that his father had faced when he first started. The difference, however, was that Marcus had inherited an empire. Aisha, on the other hand, had inherited nothing but bloodied hands and broken dreams. "Why do you guys work with tools like this?" Marcus asked, his voice softer now, laced with frustration. He tried to sound innocent, but he couldn't hide the dismay creeping into his tone. Aisha didn't respond at first, her gaze flicking over the scattered equipment. A torque wrench held together with duct tape, a drill with no safety guard, gloves so torn they barely covered her hands. The hydraulic jack was leaking oil onto the floor. "Welcome to the real world," she said, her words dry, as she managed to lift the heavy engine with her good arm. "Peter says new tools don't fit in the budget." Marcus's mind raced. He glanced over to Peter Griffin, the regional manager, who was watching from his office. The man had always rubbed him the wrong way. Too polished, too arrogant, too eager to climb the corporate ladder without regard for the people who made the business what it was. But now, watching Aisha's bloodied hand and the state of the equipment, Marcus realized just how deep the rot ran. He turned to look at Peter, who was now walking toward them, his expression sour. "Aisha," Peter snapped, "that Honda Civic should have been done an hour ago. And you, rookie," he sneered at Marcus, "carry those boxes to the warehouse or your first week here will also be your last." Aisha stiffened at Peter's voice, the tone of an order meant to demean rather than direct. She didn't flinch, but Marcus saw the way she braced herself for the verbal blow, the way she shut down, like a soldier preparing for battle. Her strength was evident, but so was her exhaustion. It was a strength born of necessity, not choice. Marcus couldn't take it any longer. He turned away, his fists clenched at his sides. He walked into the warehouse, his eyes scanning the shelves for something. Anything that might help him make sense of what he was witnessing. Didn't take long. A worn file on a rusted metal shelf caught his attention. He opened it, his heart sinking with each page he turned. Accident reports. Dozens of them. Aisha's name appeared again and again, along with other employees he didn't recognize. Deep cuts, bruises, chemical burns, all attributed to human error or employee negligence. But it was the memo that hit him hardest. An internal document from Peter to the corporate headquarters detailing how he was optimizing costs by postponing equipment maintenance and repairs. The blood drained from Marcus's face. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't just negligence. It was corporate malfeasance, sanctioned at the highest levels. His own finance department had signed off on these decisions, and it had cost people like Aisha their safety, their lives. He closed the file with trembling hands, a wave of shame washing over him. The very thing his father had fought against, the exploitation of workers, was happening under his watch. And Aisha, she was the one paying the price. Marcus returned to the garage, his mind racing. He saw Aisha again, now struggling to remove a brake with the wrong-sized wrench. Her hands shook slightly. Whether from the pain or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. "Are you just going to stand there?" she asked, not looking up, her voice tired but tinged with a hint of challenge. "Why are you still here?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Aisha paused for a moment, her gaze hardening. "Because here, as bad as it is, at least they know I can do my job. The rest of them, they can't say the same." The weight of her words hit him hard. Aisha wasn't just a victim of her circumstances. She was a survivor, a woman who had fought tooth and nail for everything she had. And Marcus realized with a gut-wrenching clarity that he had a choice to make. He could ignore what he had seen and go on with his life, or he could do something about it. But deep down, he knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about profit anymore. This was about people. People like Aisha, who were willing to bleed for a company that didn't even see them. And Marcus Blake wasn't going to let that happen any longer. The plan was beginning to form in his mind, but there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, and Marcus was going to make sure the whole world saw it. As Marcus sat in his car that night, parked in the empty parking lot, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The hum of the engine was the only sound, yet it felt deafening to him, drowning out the thoughts that swirled around his head. He stared at the dark garage, its doors closed for the night, but for Marcus, the real work was just beginning. The facade he had built, his life as the successful CEO of Blake Tech Automotive, was crumbling, and now he couldn't pretend any longer. The truth had to come out, but he wasn't alone in his thoughts. Across the street, in the dim light of a rundown apartment building, stood a figure Marcus had never truly noticed before. Jenna. She was a neighbor who lived a few doors down from the garage, someone who had always waved from a distance but kept to herself. Tonight, though, her eyes were fixed on the garage, too. She stood on her balcony, a cigarette hanging loosely from her lips, watching the same building that had once been a symbol of success for Marcus's father. Jenna was no stranger to the world of hard work and exploitation. In fact, it was all too familiar to her. She had grown up in the neighborhood, watched people like Aisha struggle, their voices unheard by the rich and powerful. Jenna's father had been a mechanic, one of the first employees at Blake Tech. He had put in long hours, worked through injuries, but it was never enough. One day, out of nowhere, he had walked away from the company, and no one knew why. Rumors swirled, but Jenna never asked him. It wasn't until her mother fell ill and the bills piled up that she realized what had happened. Her father had been forced to retire early, his hands crippled by years of labor, only to be replaced by younger, cheaper workers. She had seen the toll it had taken on him, the years of physical pain, the humiliation of being discarded after giving his best years to the company. And as she watched Marcus now, sitting alone in his car, she couldn't help but wonder if he had any idea of the damage his company had caused to the very people who had helped build it. She hadn't seen Aisha around for a while. and now it made sense. The hard-working mechanic who had lived in the same area as Jenna for years had never been the one to complain. But Jenna knew the signs. Long hours, constant injuries, and most notably, the battered equipment. She had seen it all before. From her balcony, Jenna had witnessed the daily grind of the garage workers. She could hear the sounds of tools clanking, voices shouting, and most disturbingly, the silence of frustration when things went wrong. It was the same cycle her father had been caught in. They gave their best, but they never received the care, the respect, or the reward they deserved. The garage had been a place of hard work and pain, and like her father, Aisha and the others had been exploited, worked until their bodies could no longer handle the strain. Jenna didn't know Marcus well, but she knew enough to see the difference between the man who had inherited the empire and the one who had built it. She knew he had grown up in a world where his father's values had meant something, but what had he done with those values? What had Marcus done to protect the people who worked for him? And what was he going to do now that he knew the truth? Jenna took another drag from her cigarette and sighed deeply. She had seen men like Peter Griffin before, men who were quick to exploit, slow to care. But what about Marcus? What would he do now that he knew? Would he remain a passive spectator, or would he finally take action? Suddenly a thought hit her. She had seen the way Marcus had looked at Aisha earlier, his eyes filled with guilt and shock. There was something in his gaze, something that wasn't there before. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment of change. This was the moment when the empire could be rebuilt, when the old values could be restored, and when people like Aisha could finally get what they deserved. But would Marcus be able to do it? Jenna flicked her cigarette into the street and headed back inside. As she walked through the door, she glanced back at the garage one last time. The lights were off, but her mind was racing with possibilities. She grabbed her phone and sent a quick text to Aisha. "You've been working too hard for too long. Stay strong. I've got your back no matter what happens." Then she turned to the window, her eyes meeting the dark silhouette of Marcus's car. She didn't know what was coming, but she felt it in her gut. This wasn't just a turning point. For Marcus, it was a turning point for the whole company, and she too would have a part in what came next. It was time for the truth to be exposed. Jenna's perspective added a layer of depth to the story, showing the connection between the people at the bottom, the workers, and the ones at the top. Through her eyes, we see the long-term effects of a company that had neglected its people for far too long. Her subtle shift in perspective mirrors the internal shift Marcus is going through, emphasizing the importance of redemption and the responsibility of those in power to create a fair and just environment. Jenna's inner turmoil reflects the complexity of the situation and her hope that Marcus, though flawed, will rise to the occasion. The following morning, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest the moment he had stepped into the garage the day before. His eyes had seen too much, heard too much, and now there was no turning back. His company was rotting from the inside out, and he was complicit in it. As much as he tried to push the guilt aside, it gnawed at him. He had inherited this empire from his father, and now he was standing at the edge of a precipice. Would he continue down the same path, just another cog in the corporate machine, or would he tear down everything and rebuild it with integrity? The sound of Aisha's steady breathing as she worked her way through another difficult repair echoed in his mind. He hadn't seen the kind of determination in someone's eyes in a long time. Aisha was not just fighting to fix cars. She was fighting for survival. Her struggle was raw and it was real. Marcus had seen firsthand how much she was sacrificing. Her safety, her well-being, all for a paycheck, all for a job that didn't value her. He had seen her bloodied hand, the way she forced herself to keep working despite the pain. And it broke something inside him. He knew he had to make a choice, but the weight of his decision was suffocating. He had been living in the shadow of his father's legacy, and now it felt like everything was collapsing. Would he make the same mistakes his father had? Or would he be the one to change the course of Blake Tech? Later that day, Marcus found himself sitting in the same worn-down warehouse where Aisha had been working, watching the way she handled the broken tools with a precision that was almost surgical. She worked quickly, almost like she was running from something. Marcus wanted to approach her, to ask her how she had gotten so strong, but words seemed to fail him. Instead, he watched her from afar, hoping she didn't notice him standing there, wondering what it would take for him to gain her trust. As Marcus turned away, he heard a voice call out from behind him. It was Peter Griffin, the same man who had made Aisha's life a living nightmare for so long. Peter's voice had a familiar edge to it, one that could cut through steel. "Aisha." Peter barked, his hands on his hips as he approached the mechanic. "That car's not going to fix itself. You better stop daydreaming and get back to work." Aisha didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge him, though Marcus saw the tension in her shoulders. It was like she had learned to block out the venom in Peter's words, as though they were a constant background noise she had long stopped listening to. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet fury. Marcus could see it, and it reminded him of the woman who had kept working through an injury that would have sent most people to the hospital. She was so much more than just a mechanic. She was a fighter. Peter, oblivious to the storm of emotion brewing inside Aisha, continued with his usual condescension. "You know, Aisha, you're lucky I'm giving you another chance. I could have replaced you like that," he snapped, snapping his fingers for emphasis. But Aisha didn't respond to him. Instead, she slowly lifted her head, her eyes locking onto Peter's with a fire Marcus hadn't seen before. For a moment, it felt like the world stood still. The tension between them was thick, like it could explode at any second. Aisha's voice, when it came, was calm but firm. "You're right. You could have replaced me, but you didn't, and I'm still here. So maybe, just maybe, that says more about you than it does about me." Marcus held his breath. Aisha had just struck a blow to Peter's ego, and it was as satisfying as it was tense. He could feel the electricity in the air. Peter's face reddened with anger, but he didn't dare respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed away, muttering curses under his breath. Aisha stood there for a moment longer, her hands still wrapped in a dirty rag, but the fire in her eyes had already softened. She was used to this. It was just another day in the garage, another round in the battle for respect. Marcus couldn't help but admire her. But as he stood there, unsure of what to say, a new figure appeared in the doorway, Vanessa Chun, the company's legal director. She walked in confidently, her presence filling the space as she approached Marcus with a quick professional smile. "Marcus," she said, her voice low but urgent, "we need to talk. It's about Peter." Marcus frowned, his pulse quickening. "What's happened now?" Vanessa's eyes flickered over to Aisha, who had resumed her work, not looking up. "I've been going through the paperwork, the audits. There's a lot more going on here than we realized." She lowered her voice even further. "Peter's been covering up a lot of things, and it's worse than we thought." Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew, deep down, that Peter's behavior had been more than just poor management. It was something far more sinister. But hearing the confirmation from Vanessa made it real. His gut twisted as he processed the implications. Vanessa continued. "Peter's been embezzling funds, not just for equipment. He's been falsifying accident reports, shifting responsibility onto employees like Aisha. His cuts to safety protocols, they're intentional." Marcus's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. His father's legacy, the company that he had inherited, had been slowly rotting from the inside out. It wasn't just about bad management or unfortunate budget cuts. It was deliberate, and now Aisha and the others were paying the price. "Do we have enough evidence?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Vanessa nodded, pulling out a folder filled with incriminating documents. "We've got enough. But Marcus, this isn't just about Peter anymore. The whole system is built on this kind of corruption. The board, the executives, everyone's complicit. Marcus felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't just Peter's mess. This was his company, his responsibility. He thought back to his father, the man who had built Blake Tech with his own hands, a mechanic who had fought for every inch of success. Marcus had been raised on his father's values. But now, as he looked at the wreckage of everything his father had worked for, he wondered how much of that was still alive in him. Was he still the man who believed in doing what was right, or had he become something else entirely? Suddenly, the weight of the decision he had to make felt unbearable. Marcus knew he had a choice to make. He could continue to hide behind his position and pretend he hadn't seen the truth. Or he could tear down the empire his father had built, start from scratch and rebuild it with integrity. But that would mean risking everything, his legacy, his career, everything he had worked for. And he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to make that choice. As he looked at Aisha again, watching her work, her face set in concentration, Marcus made up his mind. He couldn't let this go on any longer. He had to act, and this time he wasn't going to do it alone. The emotional and moral tension in Marcus was building up, but now, with Vanessa's information and the silent support from Aisha, the decision to confront Peter and the company's corruption had become a matter of principle. The line had been drawn, and Marcus knew there would be no turning back. The day Marcus Blake had been dreading had arrived. The boardroom was set, the shareholders filled the room, and the tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. On one side, Marcus stood, his posture straight but his mind racing with the consequences of what he was about to do. On the other side, a group of executives, led by Richard Townsend, were ready to pounce. It was the final battle for Marcus's future at Blake Tech, and everything depended on the truth coming to light. Marcus had already made his decision. There was no going back now. The files he had gathered, the evidence of Peter's corruption, the forged reports, the accidents that had been swept under the rug, they all sat in front of the board members, undeniable and damning. But there was more at stake than just Peter's downfall or his own career. What Marcus had realized through this entire process was that Blake Tech had strayed far from the values it was built on: integrity, respect for employees, accountability. Those values which his father had passed on to him had been buried beneath the drive for profit, and Marcus had been complicit in letting that happen, but not anymore. The room quieted as Marcus stood up, holding the projector remote in his hand. He looked out at the faces of the shareholders, the same faces that had watched the company grow under his leadership. Now he was about to show them what that growth had really cost. He clicked the button, and the screen behind him lit up with images: the old garage, broken tools, the worn faces of workers who had given everything only to be discarded. "This," Marcus said, his voice steady, "this is the cost of cutting corners. This is what happens when we prioritize profits over people." He clicked again. The screen now displayed photos of Aisha, her bloodied hand, the torn gloves, and the dangerous conditions they worked under. "I am responsible for this," Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. "I am the CEO and I should have known, but I didn't. I allowed this to happen." A murmur ran through the room. A few faces softened, but most were skeptical. Marcus could feel the pressure building, the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. But he had come this far. The truth had to be spoken. He clicked again, and the next image showed the forged documents Peter had been hiding. The falsified accident reports, the cost-cutting measures that had led to employee injuries, and the signed approvals for unsafe practices. The board members' eyes darted to one another, whispers filling the air. Richard Townsend, who had been sitting with a smug expression, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "This is what we've been hiding," Marcus said, locking eyes with Richard. "This is what happens when we allow greed to take precedence over the people who work to make us successful. And this is why today I am making the decision to remove Peter from his position." Immediately, the room went silent. Richard stood up, his face red with anger. "You can't do this, Marcus. You're throwing away years of progress for what? Some misguided sense of morality?" Marcus didn't flinch. I'm doing this for the future of this company, Richard, for the future of every single person who works here. And I'm doing it because I have a responsibility to my father's legacy, to the values he instilled in me. We've lost our way, and it's time to bring Blake Tech back to its roots. He turned to face the room, his voice gaining strength. It's time for us to rebuild, not just the company, but the culture. A culture that values integrity, a culture where our employees' safety and well-being come first, a culture where every person, no matter their background, is treated with the respect they deserve. Marcus looked at the board members, their faces now full of uncertainty. He knew that what he was saying wasn't just about removing one man. It was about changing the entire direction of the company. A shift that would take time, effort, and most importantly, trust. Trust from the employees, trust from the customers, and trust from the board. I'm also implementing new policies, Marcus continued, his gaze now shifting to Aisha, who stood in the back of the room, silently watching. We will not tolerate discrimination or unsafe working conditions any longer. Aisha, I want you to be part of this transformation. You will lead the new Safety and Compliance Department. I'm giving you the authority to make the changes we need. Aisha's eyes widened, surprise flickering across her face. She had been working for so long in the shadows, unnoticed. But now, Marcus was giving her a voice, giving her the platform to make the changes she had longed for. For a moment, the room held its breath as Aisha slowly walked forward. Her voice, when it came, was firm, unwavering. I'll do whatever it takes, she said. But I'm not doing it for the company. I'm doing it for the people who work here, for the ones who've been hurt by this system, for the ones who never had a voice. The board members exchanged glances, but Marcus knew that Aisha's words had struck a chord. This wasn't just about making money anymore. This was about making a difference. As the meeting came to a close, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. The truth had been laid bare. The first step toward rebuilding had been taken. There was no going back, but in that moment, Marcus knew he was finally doing the right thing. Weeks passed, and Blake Tech began its transformation. New equipment arrived, safety protocols were implemented, and most importantly, the culture of the company began to shift. Aisha led the charge, ensuring that every employee, no matter their role, had the tools and support they needed to succeed. Marcus worked closely with her, listening to her ideas, watching her grow into the leader she had always been meant to be. The company's profits did take a hit in the short term, but Marcus didn't mind. He had learned something that no balance sheet could measure. The true value of a company wasn't in its bottom line. It was in how it treated its people. Months later, Marcus stood in the newly renovated garage, watching as Aisha gave a tour to a group of young mechanics. She was confident now, standing tall, her voice commanding respect. And Marcus, standing behind her, realized just how far they had come. Blake Tech had been built on a foundation of integrity, but it had faltered. Now it was being rebuilt with those same values, stronger than ever. And as he looked at Aisha, he knew that the company's future was in good hands, because true success, Marcus had learned, wasn't about the money. It was about dignity. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything. And in that moment, Marcus Blake felt the weight of his father's legacy, not as a burden, but as a guide, leading him toward a future that honored the values he had once almost lost. And with that, Marcus smiled, knowing the journey was far from over, but it had finally begun on the right path.